Early spring in Enfield, Connecticut still feels like winter. It's the kind of suburban town where people know each other, where kids play outside until the streetlights come on, and the sound of the school bus is just part of the background. But on the morning of March 18th, 2026, that normal routine broke apart. A 911 call came in. It was a mother, her voice panicked, saying her 12-year-old daughter wasn't responding. When first responders got to the house on Elm Street, what they found set off an investigation that would uncover secrets, raise difficult questions, and reveal a truth that is very hard to sit with. This is the story of Eve Rogers and the man who was supposed to keep her safe. Eve Rogers was 12 years old. She was trying to find her way in a world that often felt more intense and more demanding for her than it does for many of us. She had autism, which meant her senses processed everything a little differently. Sounds could be sharper, lights brighter, the world a bit more overwhelming. She also lived with POTS, postural orthostatic tachycardia syndrome, a nerve condition that could send her heart racing and make her dizzy or faint. And at the time, she was being evaluated for bipolar disorder. But that list of diagnoses doesn't tell you who Eve actually was. She was someone's daughter, someone's sister. She loved losing herself in music and the soft glow of her computer screen, and she found peace in the simple back-and-forth rhythm of a swing in her room. Her home was on Elm Street, where she lived with her mother, Anthony Federline, her stepfather, Anthony, and 3 siblings, including a 17-year-old brother. From the outside, they were a blended family, living a quiet life. But there were undercurrents. Anthony Federline was 39. During the day, he drove a school bus for the Smith Bus Company, a job where parents hand over their kids and trust you'll bring them home safe. In the evenings, he and Melanie ran an online spiritual business called Grounded Fire. They offered tarot readings and Reiki sessions over video calls. It all seemed a little alternative, maybe even a bit free-spirited. But the picture of that family life was about to be torn down, and what was hiding behind it was something deeply wrong. Let's walk through the timeline, starting on the evening of Monday, March 17th. Melanie told investigators she saw Eve alive that night between 8 and 8:30. Eve was in her room with the door locked. That wasn't exactly unusual for her, but in the hours that followed, it would take on a much heavier meaning. The house went quiet for the night. Tuesday morning, March 18th, Melanie went to get Eve up for school. She knocked on the locked door and got nothing back. A knot of worry forming, she used a butter knife to pop the simple lock. What she found inside changed everything. Eve was face down on the floor. Her body was cold. Melanie's first thought was that Eve must have fallen asleep in a weird spot, but when she turned her over, she saw her daughter's face and the signs that something was terribly wrong. She screamed for her husband and called 911 just after 10:25 that morning. Police and paramedics arrived to find Melanie, her older son, and Anthony Federline at the house. Eve Rogers was lying on her bedroom floor. A blanket had been pulled up over the lower half of her body. But even with that covering, the signs were unmistakable. Investigators noted lividity, where blood pools after death, on her face, legs, and arms. Rigor mortis had already set in. There was blood and fluid coming from her nose. And when the death investigator moved the blanket, they found Eve was naked from the waist down, and her bra had been pulled down. This wasn't just a sad medical situation. This was the start of a criminal investigation. The Connecticut State Police Major Crime Unit came in to help local authorities, and they started working through Eve's bedroom carefully. It should have been her safe space. Instead, it was a snapshot of teenage life cut short. A laptop sat open on the floor, stuck on a YouTube page. But there were other things that stood out right away. Pills scattered around. 2 unidentified pills near the door, one reddish or pink, one clear with white powder inside, and a white tablet marked aspirin on her desk. In the middle of all that initial activity, Anthony Federline didn't sit down for a long interview. According to police reports, he was visibly upset, angry even, and he told a detective he needed space because he wanted to break things. He explained to officers that Eve was autistic, had POTS, and was being looked at for bipolar disorder. He was offering medical reasons for her death before an autopsy had even been done. On the surface, he was a grieving stepfather. But to investigators, something felt off. The way he held himself, the way he spoke. There was a puzzle here, and the pieces were all over that floor. Because of how Eve's body was found, the medical examiner's office did something important before the full autopsy. They performed a sexual assault evidence collection kit. Swabs were taken. At the same time, detectives started gathering DNA from everyone in the house: Eve's mom, her 3 siblings, and Anthony Federline. Federline agreed to give his DNA sample, though he made a point of saying it felt like they were just rubbing salt in the wound. Looking back, that comment doesn't sound like a man lost in grief. It sounds like someone trying to push back against something he knew was coming. And then the forensic results came in. On April 2nd, the state lab report landed. The swabs had picked up male DNA. When they compared it to the family samples, it pointed squarely at one person. The lab said the DNA profile found on Eve's body was at least 1 trillion times more likely to have come from Anthony Federline than from some random person. 1 trillion. It's a number that's hard to wrap your head around, but in a criminal case, it's basically a fingerprint that can't be wiped away. Later that same day, April 2nd, Anthony Federline was arrested. The charges: first-degree sexual assault and risk of injury to a child. Bond was set at $1 million. The man who drove the school bus, who talked about energy and spiritual healing, was now formally accused of sexually assaulting his 12-year-old stepdaughter. The forensics didn't stop at the DNA. The medical examiner's findings filled in more of what Eve had been through. The exam showed signs of vaginal penetration that had happened 1 to 3 days before she died. That puts the assault right up against the time she was found dead. But here's where it gets complicated. There were no obvious signs of physical injury on Eve's body that explained why she died. The assault was a separate, awful act, but was it what killed her? That question was left hanging, waiting on toxicology tests that could take weeks or months to come back. Meanwhile, the investigation kept growing, spreading into new areas that were just as concerning. Search warrants in the days after the arrest showed police were now focused on digital evidence. They had taken a Samsung phone and an Amazon tablet from the house, and that HP laptop found open on Eve's floor. That was now a key piece of the puzzle. Investigators believed the data on those devices could show what Eve was doing in her final days, and importantly, could reveal messages between Eve and her stepfather or someone else that might lead to a more serious charge: murder. As more details came out, the contradictions started to pile up. Anthony Federline had been quick to bring up Eve's medical issues, like they would explain everything. But a week before she was found dead, an official from the State Department of Children and Families had encountered Eve alone in the middle of the night. This wasn't just a girl with health problems. This was a kid whose home life was clearly not stable. And then there was the Grounded Fire website. After Eve died, Melanie Federline kept writing blog posts about self-awareness on the business page. She didn't mention her daughter. She didn't mention the tragedy that had just happened inside her own home. It was a detail that stuck with people following the case. It felt like a real disconnect from the reality of the situation. But maybe the biggest disconnect was between who the community thought Anthony Federline was and what the evidence was starting to show. He had passed all the required background checks to drive a school bus. He'd only been on the job about 6 months when he was arrested. The school superintendent made it clear he was vetted, no disqualifying criminal history. But after his arrest, prosecutors pointed out he did have a prior record in Massachusetts from years back. Driving offenses, shoplifting, trespassing. Nothing major, misdemeanors, but still. It was a history they hadn't known about. And then parents started speaking up. One father, Malcolm Maxwell Frechette, whose 7-year-old son rode Federline's bus, said parents had complained for months. They said he was irritable, frustrated, and unfair. They claimed he'd let kids off without a guardian there and spoke nastily to them. They called, they went to the school, they voiced their concerns, but they felt like nobody listened. The bus company said they only had one official complaint on file, but the fear these parents felt was real. They had seen something in this guy that made them uneasy, and for 2 weeks after Eve died, while the DNA was being tested, he was still driving their kids. The community was left asking how that could happen. The answer is unsettling and straightforward. Until the DNA came back, he wasn't officially a suspect. He was just a stepfather who was sad. So why would someone do this? A stepfather, a so-called spiritual healer, a person trusted with children's safety. There's rarely one simple answer. Usually it comes down to power, control, and access. Eve was vulnerable. Her autism and other conditions might have made her an easier target in his mind. Maybe he thought she wouldn't be believed or wouldn't be able to say clearly what was happening. She spent a lot of time in her room, behind a locked door. And Anthony Federline was the adult male in the house, in a position of authority. He had access. And for someone who wants to hurt a child, access is everything. I can't give you a psychological profile that makes sense of child abuse. It doesn't make sense. It's a betrayal of the most basic trust we have. But looking at the facts, you see a man who showed one face to the public and another to his stepdaughter. When police asked for his DNA, he didn't say, "Whatever you need to find out what happened." He complained about salt being rubbed in his wound. The focus was on him. It's a small thing, but it tells you a lot about where his head might have been. The legal side moved forward. Anthony Federline was arraigned in Hartford Superior Court on Monday, April 6, 2026. Because of the nature of the charges, cameras weren't allowed in, and the proceedings stayed pretty private. He heard the accusations read out. First-degree sexual assault of his 12-year-old stepdaughter who had autism. He didn't enter a plea that day. The judge kept the bond at $1 million. He was given a public defender, and the next court date was set for early May. But here's what stood out most from that courtroom appearance. He was charged with sexual assault. He was not charged with murder. Not yet. The prosecution and police were waiting. They needed the medical examiner to tell them exactly how and why Eve Rogers died. Without that, they couldn't bring the full weight of the case forward. The sexual assault charges were solid, backed by DNA, but they felt like the first step. Everyone involved knew that more serious charges might be coming, just waiting in the background. The fallout in Enfield and beyond has been heavy. A family is broken. Melanie Federline put out a short statement saying she knew nothing about the allegations and that her focus now was on her other kids, asking for privacy as she tries to get through something that feels impossible. A GoFundMe was started to help with funeral costs, a small way for the community to try and help with a loss that's hard to fathom. For the town, there's a lot of fear and anger left behind. Parents who put their kids on Anthony Federline's bus every day are shaken. They're asking how the system let them down so badly. The school and bus company are offering counseling and say they'll review how they do things, but the sense of safety in that community has been cracked. It's a hard reminder that sometimes dangerous people hide in plain sight, wearing a bus driver's jacket or the calm smile of a spiritual guide. Right now, Anthony Federline is still in jail at the Hartford Correctional Center. He's being held on that $1 million bond, waiting for his next court date. The investigation isn't closed. The State Department of Children and Families is also looking into the death and the assault allegations, working alongside the police. So for now, the story of Eve Rogers and Anthony Federline doesn't end with a clear resolution. It ends with a lot of quiet, heavy questions. We know a 12-year-old girl is gone. She loved music and her own little world, and now that world is empty. We know, with near scientific certainty, that the man meant to protect her sexually assaulted her just before she died. The forensics are clear on that. But the biggest question is still out there. What actually killed Eve Rogers? Was it the pills found on her bedroom floor? Was it a sudden complication from her medical conditions that just happened to coincide with the assault? Or did Anthony Federline do something else? Something that didn't leave a visible mark but stopped her breathing? The answers might be inside that HP laptop or on the phone and tablet police seized. They might hold the final part of Eve's story, explaining how a sexual assault turned into a death with no obvious cause. Until the toxicology report is finished and the digital evidence is combed through, the full truth stays just beyond our reach. We're left waiting, and we're left remembering a young girl whose life was cut short in a way that is as cruel as it is hard to understand. If this story touched you or gave you something to think about, do me a quick favor. Hit that like button and drop one word in the comments that best describes how you feel right now. And if you want more stories like this delivered straight to you, join our growing community by subscribing and turning on the bell notification. Every single subscriber helps us keep creating meaningful stories that actually matter. Thank you for watching. I'll see you in the next one.